So as the United States, and particularly the northeastern part of the United States, is becoming more culturally diverse, more ethnically diverse, more religiously diverse, we also see diversity in ideas. Some of the things that we talked about earlier were transcendentalism, new religious ideas, new philosophies that are taking place. And as a result, we see some important reforms that begin to take place. You probably recall one of the most popular reforms in the first part of American history, as well as in the second part of American history, is this idea of temperance. And so Northerners began to organize to promote certain reforms in very different ways, but primarily these middle class white folks, white participants, really are drawn to reforms. And the reason for that is that in addition to having the time, right, to engage in reforms, they also have the money to invest in reforms, and they also view this as their role in society, their way of contributing. But immigrants, members from the working class, farmers, and African Americans also participated in reforms to improve society, and their work should not be understated. So the variety of reform movements and their participants was reflected in the different techniques that were employed to reach their goals. Particularly men, women, and minority groups utilized different methods that they had available to them. So people used their class position, their work position, and their religious experiences to advocate for different reforms. Groups with the most limited political rights begin to establish charitable organizations. They begin to distribute food and medication and also to construct asylums. They circulated petitions, and they also organized boycotts, arranged for meetings and lectures, and began to publish newspapers and pamphlets to disseminate information. So the wealthiest might have donated significant amounts of money to establish buildings, to establish charitable organizations, while the middle class might organize for meetings and host lectures. But the poorest folks would disseminate information. And so everyone did their part to advocate for reforms. Reformers typically attached a single issue and often employed a range of techniques that would change and adapt over time. For example, those who advocated for anti-prostitution would pray in front of brothels. They would publish newspaper articles and establish what they called moral reform societies. They would also petition the legislators to stiffen the penalties for men who engaged with prostitutes, in addition to punishments for prostitution. The temperance movement is probably the most widely known movement because ultimately in the United States we will establish a law that makes the sale, distribution, and consumption, as well as manufacturing of alcohol, as an illegal crime that is punishable by time in prison. So the temperance movement has been around since the 1600s, but we see an improvement in the ability of those who advocate for temperance to organize and promote their reform. Many of these reformers were drawn to the temperance movement, and as the people involved became, as more people became involved across all social lines, the goal gradually shifted from moderation and decreasing the amount of alcohol consumed to complete abstinence from alcohol. Temperance drew the support from the working men because working men believed that advocating for temperance would give them dignity and respect, and it would separate them or differentiate them from the caricatures of the Irish Catholic workers who were drunkards. Recall that at this time, when we see this increase in immigration, this increase in diversity, we also see a lot of discrimination and racism in how we view those around us. The temperance supporters turned to legal mechanisms to decrease alcohol consumption, and by 1855, 12 states had limited the sales of alcohol as well as the manufacturing of alcohol. Again, this is 1855, and 12 states limit the alcohol sales and manufacturing. Another form of change that we see is this utopian idea. And we have utopian societies that develop as a way to model the changes that are needed throughout society by using what is called a self-contained community. So the community members would live in a particular area, and they would contribute in terms of labor, in terms of making the community or the farm work and run, and everyone would be sort of treated as an equal. Everyone would have a job to do, and everyone would kind of have a place in the society. Francis Wright, Robert Owen, and Robert Dale Owen established several utopian communities in the United States. These experiments in equality and communalism ultimately failed, but they sparked fierce debates regarding the concept of communal labor, gender equality, and racial justice. Remember, these communities are built on the principle that all people, regardless of their race, gender, or sex, are created equal and should contribute equally to the community in terms of labor. George Ripley created the utopian community in Massachusetts during the 1840s that merged the ideas of physical and intellectual labor. Ripley's community and others were inspired by the French socialist Charles Fourier regarding cooperation as a means of combating the effects of capitalism. Now, the idea is that physical and intellectual labor are to be treated equal because each person is contributing what they are able to contribute. The challenge here for Fourier and Ripley is that thinking about tilling land doesn't actually till the land. And so for the community, we see a lot of frustration in how tasks will be accomplished. Ultimately, people did not feel that they were being treated equally and valued equally for their contributions. And then finally, the Oneida community, which was established in New York in 1844, merged the ideas of this utopian communalism with sexual freedom for men and women. It attracted hundreds of residents, and after its founding, and thrived for several decades. Ultimately, though, you probably are most familiar with the Oneida community and their work in silverware. They ultimately began to produce forks, knives, spoons, plateware to be sold in order to maintain the supplies that they needed for their communities. As we're seeing this increase in ideas, this increase in diversity, as we start to see an increase in reform involvement and ultimately advocating for reforms that are passed, we see that many people become interested in the issue of slavery, concerned about the issue of slavery, and for many folks, finally aware that slavery does exist in the United States. For those in the North, many did not truly understand what slavery meant. They understood that slavery was real and that it existed, but they had never seen the impact of slavery firsthand. David Walker wrote The Appeal to the Colored Citizens and offered a militant and radical African American perspective. He combined the ideas of abolitionism with the rejection of colonization and a warning that violence would come if whites did not free their slaves. David Walker is white, and this is important because he writes in a way that truly reaches the reader because he can truly empathize with the slave. His warning in the appeal to the colored citizens is written after the Nat Turner Rebellion, which struck fear in the heart of the white Southerner. Inspired by David Walker, William Lloyd Garrison, who was a Bostonian, began publishing an abolitionist newspaper. The paper was called The Liberator, in which he urged white reformers to consider the wrongs that slavery imposed on blacks rather than the moral and practical implications of slavery for whites. So he takes a slightly different approach. He says rather than focus on the moral issue of slavery, let's just look at the fact that it's wrong to these people. Because remember, many whites did not believe that slavery was immoral because they did not view African Americans as equals or even as humans. And recall, the state's legislatures have already codified slavery in their law, and they have used the word chattel, which means movable property, to define black slaves. In 1833, William Lloyd Garrison organized the American Anti-Slavery Society with the goal of protesting slavery. Some of his followers also helped slaves to escape to the free states on the Underground Railroad. Sarah and Angelina Grimke, or the Grimke sisters, also joined the American Anti-Slavery Society. They offered their first-hand experiences of slavery as daughters of a Southern slave owner. So the message against slavery has a lot of different layers. We are hearing from Northern leaders who haven't necessarily seen slavery firsthand, but are very passionate about ending slavery. We're also hearing from people who have actually seen slavery firsthand. They've lived in the households where slavery existed. They've had slaves themselves to help them. And so they're adding their voice to this message. But because the Grimke sisters were women, of course, their public participation in the anti-slavery movement produced a lot of protest from those who do not believe that women should be active in politics or that their voice mattered. Maria Stewart, who was a free black, preceded the Grimke sisters in speaking out publicly against slavery. A free black and a white Quaker woman in Philadelphia began to form an interracial anti-slavery society. The abolitionist movement begins to expand into the western frontier, where many new anti-slavery groups are also being formed. Recall, the frontier area has decided that slavery will not exist in the territory, not necessarily the states that will come into the United States, but the territories. However, slaves who run away to those territories must be returned to their masters. And so the ideas of anti-slavery, the ideas of equality begin to spread into the West as well. Many new groups were formed in the western areas, including many in which male and female abolitionists could work together side by side to abolish slavery. Some of the older ideas, the more traditional ideas of men's and women's separate spheres, aren't as entrenched in the West because women will work alongside their husbands on farms in the West. As the abolition movement begins to grow and take root, there is, of course, opposition. Some Northerners opposed abolitionism because they felt the abolitionist movement would be responded to with violence. Abolitionists engaged in a huge petition drive in 1836 and 1837. And so what they did was they wrote a lot of letters, they wrote a lot of pamphlets, and they widely disseminated this information over this 2-year period. But this resulted in some of the congressmen actually reading those petitions on the floor in the Congress. So Congress promptly passed a gag rule in 1836 that made it illegal and banned the petitions from being read on the House floor. Remember, the defining issue in agreeing on this Constitution that we've adopted really centered on whether or not slavery should or should not be legal. And ultimately, the compromise is reached based on how slaves will be counted for population purposes as well as for taxation purposes. So neither Southern congressmen and many Northern congressmen really wanted the conversation of abolitionism to be carried out and discussed on the House floor because it would create a lot of conflict. Fugitive slaves advanced the abolitionist cause because they offered a first-hand account of the horrors of slavery. As I mentioned, many Northerners did not truly understand what slavery looked like. They had kind of a vision, if you will, of slaves sort of working joyfully on the farm and joyfully in the home. And the reality of slavery, of course, is much, much harsher, especially as slavery becomes much, much more connected to the economic success of the whole country, which we talked about in the previous chapter. One of the most important slaves was Frederick Douglass, who published an autobiography. He led speaking tours in Europe. He began an anti-slavery newspaper and raised funds to support the movement. But some abolitionists, even though they're advocating for the ending of slavery, continue to hold on to racist ideas, even while they're working to end slavery. And this really divides the movement. It also revealed the limits of white abolitionist ideas as the movement continues to grow. So while some of these abolitionists did not support slavery and advocated for the end of slavery, they were not advocating for complete equality for African Americans. And that is important because there are just two distinct elements of the anti-slavery or abolitionist movement. There were a lot of conflicts within religious denominations as a result of abolitionism. Many denominations had churches in the North and the South, and so many churches in the South fully supported slavery, while some churches in the North may not support slavery. And so for religious organizations, it was very difficult to have an official statement from the church because that would risk losing either all of your churches in the North if you supported slavery or all of your churches in the South if you were against slavery. Some individuals did endorse abolitionism, but the most famous one, the Society of Friends or the Quakers, are the only large denomination that took an unequivocal stand against slavery from the beginning. So again, the Quakers unequivocally opposed slavery from the beginning as a whole. The new abolitionist churches began to be created as a result, as abolitionists began to encourage individuals to separate from the mainstream churches that did not outright reject slavery. So again, we are in a very diverse time in our nation's history, diverse in ideas, diverse in philosophies, diverse in religion, and now we're seeing the impact of this abolition movement continue to fracture churches. The growing divide over women's public involvement in the movement actually splits the American Anti-Slavery Society. The American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society was formed by those who left the American Anti-Slavery Society. They were dissidents who opposed women's participation in any closed meeting with men. The American Anti-Slavery Society expanded women's roles as a result. They appointed Lucretia Mott and several other women as delegates to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, which met in 1840. So again, to make sure that we understand, the American anti-slavery movement is formed. It is racially, ethnically, and sexually diverse. And ultimately, the amount of involvement that women should have in the movement leads to a fracture. And so the American and foreign anti-slavery is formed by those who leave the American Anti-Slavery Society because they do not believe that men and women should debate these issues behind closed doors. When the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention is held, members of the American Anti-Slavery Society attend, but most of the men at the convention refused to allow Lucretia Mott and other women to participate. So globally, right, even though slavery exists in other parts of the world, so does sexism. And many of these leaders at this World Anti-Slavery Convention refused to allow any participation from women. This, of course, fueled Lucretia Mott's belief that women needed to gain more rights for themselves in order to be effective in the abolitionist movement. So now some women will say, in order to advocate for the end of slavery, we have to advocate for our own rights first. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized a convention that focus specifically on women's rights. This convention is held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. They produce what they call a Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, and it specifically sounds a lot like the Declaration of Independence, which was written much, much earlier, but they call for equality. They call for independence for females. This convention in Seneca Falls and another in Rochester, New York, do draw support from Black abolitionists, particularly and importantly, Frederick Douglass.